chapter 12 from the Kildee house, okay? Jerome was as fussed as a mother hen with 2 broods of chicks. For a week, the young raccoons had been getting out of their nests and exploring the house. Every time Jerome took a step, he had to look to make sure he didn't step on a young bandit.
Wait, did he add another story in his house? Or was that just
No, that was just what they were talking about doing. The skunk families had arrived, and as near as he could make out, there would be 27 spotted skunks frisking in and out of his house as soon as the little ones grew big enough to follow their mothers. The father raccoons had returned to help with the raising of their children. To add to his worries, Donald was coming up regularly. He was spending a lot of time on the hill. At first, he had been very careful to scout the place before showing himself, but as of late, he was getting careless. The raccoons fascinated him, and he was impatient for the day when the skunks would all march into the house. It was wearing on the nerves, having him barely miss bumping into Emma Lou. So far, neither of them had come up with any ideas as to what Jerome was going to do about the housing problem. So far, the raccoons and the skunks had got along. The mother and the father skunks came up for food, but they always hurried back to their young ones. The little raccoons seemed to understand from the start that they had better not bother the skunks. But there was no telling what would happen when the skunks started bringing their youngsters into the house. The skunks might decide to clean out the raccoons once for all. Trouble could start over anything, a bit of meat or a scared baby skunk calling for help when a big raccoon popped out from under the bed a few inches away. One day, Donald brought a squirrel cage up from his place. It had a wheel in it for the squirrels to use as a racetrack. Donald took one end out of the cage so the little skunks could get in and out. The papa and the mama skunks soon discovered that what the wheel was for, and it had gay times racing around and around. What does that mean, gay times?
Happy times.
Happy times. Sometimes as many as 3 tried to use the wheel at the same time. This always caused a wild scramble and considerable loud talk. As soon as Donald left, Jerome hid the cage so that Emma Lou would not see it. But the skunks liked it so much that he put it back after she left. One evening, he forgot to hide it, and the next day, Emma Lou saw it. She pounced upon it and called for Jerome. "Look what I found," she said when Jerome poked his head out of the door. "That Cabot wretch has sneaked up here and is trying to trap our skunks." Jerome came out and stood blinking at the cage. He knew he wouldn't be able to tell Emma Lou a fib she would believe. "It's not a trap," he said. Emma Lou frowned at the cage. She wasn't convinced. Just then a pair of skunks slipped out from under the house. They hopped into the cage and darted to the wheel. Round and round they went in a giddy whirl of flying feet and waving plumes. Emma Lou watched them for a time, then she sat down beside the cage, and after a while she started to laugh. "They love it," she said slowly. Then she looked up at Jerome and saw that he was looking very guilty. "He's been coming up here, hasn't he?" "Who? Who's been coming up?" Donald Cabot. "Yes," Jerome said. Emma Lou's eyes followed the little skunk who was still racing inside the wheel. Jerome waited for the blow-up he was sure was coming. After a bit, she said, "I guess he has as much right here as I do." She got to her feet. "I guess I'll be getting on home." Jerome wanted to say something, but he couldn't think of anything. He had expected her to blow up and kick things around. Instead, she just looked hurt. She acted as though Jerome had ordered her off the mountain. She was gone before he could think of any way to explain matters to her. An hour later, Donald arrived. Jerome was feeling very low. He felt like a traitor. Donald noticed he looked worried. "Don't you worry about a thing," he said. "I'm working on a grand scheme." He grinned broadly. "I'll clear your cabin of every raccoon and every skunk you want to get rid of." Jerome perked up at once. "I won't sell any of them. Not one goes to a fur farm or to any hunt club. I'll move out and give them the house before I let any bunch of hunters chase them with dogs." "Nothing like that," Donald said cheerfully. "Well, that wasn't what was worrying me," Jerome said. "Why can't you and Emma Lou stop fighting?" Donald looked at Jerome sharply. "She found out I'm coming up here?" "Yes, and she walked out on me, and I doubt if she'll come back. She thinks I double-crossed her," Jerome said. "Good riddance," Donald said cheerfully. "But she'll come back." "She wasn't mad. She just walked away," Jerome said. "Forget it," Donald advised. "I brought a sack of roasting ears up for the coons. I read in a book that they go for green corn." He picked up the sack he had set on the doorstone and walked into the house. Jerome followed him indoors. Donald pulled an ear of corn from the sack. He stripped back the husks and broke off a piece of the ear. A half-dozen big and little raccoons had crowded around and were sniffing eagerly. Runt was the quickest and got the piece of corn ear first. Being a California raccoon, she knew nothing of the delicious milky flavor of a roasting ear. Holding the ear in her paws, she nibbled off a kernel and sampled it. Her eyes began to sparkle, and she looked around suspiciously to make sure none of the other raccoons were close enough to snatch the prize from her. Quickly, she snipped off the kernels and munched them. Her youngsters crowded around, demanding a taste, but she sat up very straight and refused to let them have a kernel. When her big mate ambled over and thrust out his snout, she snapped at him. He backed away and sat down, a gloomy expression coming over his face. Donald laughed. He began passing out pieces of corn ear. Every raccoon, big and little, got a sample, and they liked it. There was much growling and snapping and pure enjoyment. Jerome forgot his gloom and enjoyed the scene. Donald passed out the last of the corn. As he poked the husks into the sack, he said, "Wish I could stay until the skunks come out, but I have to be home for dinner tonight." Jerome laughed. He felt pretty good all of a sudden, and it had hit him like a flash of bright light. "How about having supper with me tomorrow night? I'll need some help. Fact is, I've been fastening the little door to keep the skunk families out. Tomorrow night, we'll get them acquainted with the raccoons." "Sure," Donald said. "I'll bring along some stuff." He tried to hide his eagerness. It was the first time Jerome had asked him up for a meal or for the evening. "Don't bring anything. This is to be my party," Jerome said. Donald knew he had made a slip. "Sure," he said. "Just don't want a sponge." He smiled quickly. "You have a mob to feed anyway." "I don't mind it a bit," Jerome said. "I can afford to feed you too. A lot of people or animals." Hey, Genevieve and Owen, can you guys sit down for a second and just wait till I finish the story? Donald nodded. He knew Jerome wasn't poor, but it was hard to think, Hannah, sit down. It was hard to think of him as a man of means because of the way he lived. He got to his feet and picked up a sack. Runt hopped about eagerly. He tossed her some peanuts. There was quite a scramble as the peanuts rolled across the floor. One little fellow got the wadded cellophane bag. He jumped up on the oven door and carefully unwrapped it. Then he thrust a paw into it and was rewarded by finding half a peanut in one corner. "I'll be up for dinner," Donald said as he opened the door. Jerome grinned at him. "I'll be expecting you." The door closed behind Donald and Jerome lighted his pipe. He leaned back in his chair and put his feet on the table. He ought to get up and latch the door. The skunks had started taking their babies for walks. They'd be bringing them into the cabin any evening now. But old Grouch was still off in the woods. Jerome saw him coming across the meadow. He shoved through the little door. He snapped at one of the young raccoons, then showed his teeth when the mother dashed to her youngster.
He small door because he's so fat.
I guess. He ambled over to Jerome's chair and sat down. His fat stomach settled down around his feet like a well-filled snack. "I'm recording, guys." He grunted sourly. Jerome blew a cloud of smoke at him. "It will be worth trying," Jerome said. Old Grouch growled. He wasn't agreeing with anyone. "Might work," Jerome puffed deeply. "May I come in?" a polite voice asked from the door. Jerome turned his head. Emily was standing there. He had never heard her speak that way, so he had not recognized her voice. "Sure, come in. You don't have to ask." He smiled at her eagerly. "I came to get the statue of old Grouch," Emmylou said. "I'd like to have it for my room." "Well, it's yours," Jerome said. Emmylou entered. The raccoons closed in around her. She hesitated, then she knelt down. She didn't miss the gnawed cobs Jerome had got around to sweeping up, or the peanut bag one of the little raccoons was playing with, but she didn't say anything. She sat on the floor and gathered as many raccoons into her lap as it would hold. "I got some news," she said. "Thought you'd like to know." "You bet I would," Jerome said. "I saw Monarch today," she said. "He was way up on the ridge above the sawmill." "That's great," Jerome said. "I'm glad he's safe." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Emmylou had sure taken a long hike to be up above the sawmill, 4 miles at least. She set the raccoons on the floor and got to her feet. Jerome watched her lift the little statue from the mantel, and he smiled at her. "I figured the little skunks may pay me a visit tonight. I haven't had any help, so I've kept the little door latched. We could have a bite and see if they've come." "I've got to get home." She was looking at the cobs on the floor. "How about coming to supper tomorrow night?" Jerome asked. "They're almost sure to visit tomorrow night." Emmylou looked at the statue thoughtfully. Then she looked at Jerome. "I guess I can come," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll cook up something special."
Tomorrow night the night with Donald.
Yes.
That's his plan.
Yes, that's his plan. After Emmylou had gone, he latched the little door. He chuckled to himself as he fixed supper. He heard scratching sounds at the little door, but he didn't open it. He would save that for tomorrow night. After supper, he swept up the cobs and cleaned a few small spots with Clorox. He fed old Grouch and the rest of his tribe. Old Grouch mellowed under the influence of the food
Keeping the skunks out at night so they come in.
and Jerome's attention. They sat before the open fire for quite a while. The scratching started again, and with it came the sounds of gnawing. Jerome got up and fixed a tray of chopped meat and breadcrumbs. He set them just outside his door. Many bright eyes twinkled in the reflected light as the skunks crowded around. "You're all invited for tomorrow night," he said as he gently shoved Papa back from the little door. Papa churned impatiently. He didn't appreciate getting the cold shoulder, not when he knew Jerome was playing host to a lot of raccoons. And that's the end of chapter 12.